The sun fell harshly across the rows of barbed wire, and the men who shuffled through the gates expected only punishment. These were German soldiers, hardened veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Europe, now reduced to captives on foreign soil. They braced for harsh labor, for insults shouted in a language they could not understand. What they did not expect was the sound of chalk scratching across a blackboard in one corner of the camp, beneath a crude wooden shelter. An American guard stood before a group of bewildered prisoners, writing simple words in block letters. "Hello, my name is... For a moment, silence held the men as tightly as the fences. Some laughed nervously, others spat in the dust. A few stared as though it were a trick, but the guard persisted, pointing, repeating, encouraging them to form the words with their mouths. Broken syllables escaped rough, uneven, filled with embarrassment. Yet the lesson continued. The weapons were not rifles, but words. Not orders, but grammar. Here, in the heart of a camp built to contain enemies. The first seeds of a different kind of battle were sown. Learning English was not in their orders, not in their training, not in their vision of war. It was absurd, almost insulting, yet it carried a hidden power. To speak the language of their captors was to glimpse the world beyond ideology, beyond the commands that had led them into disaster. In the barracks that night, whispers carried, "Why teach us? What do they want?" Some suspected manipulation, others shrugged it off. But a few young men practiced the strange sounds under their breath, rolling the foreign syllables like contraband. This contradiction, prisoners of war taught by their guards, sets the stage for a journey where language itself became a battlefield, where every word spoken broke down another wall of hate and suspicion. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time of day is it right now? And what time of... The lessons did not end with a single blackboard under a wooden roof. Slowly, they spread across the camp, becoming part of the daily rhythm. Guards who had once only barked commands now stood in front of groups of prisoners, repeating simple English words: bread, water, book, freedom. The men sat on rough benches, notebooks fashioned from scraps of paper, pencils borrowed or begged, and practiced words that felt alien on their tongues. The irony was heavy soldiers trained to destroy America now struggled to pronounce its language. The Americans understood something subtle. Language was more than vocabulary. It was a tool to disarm without bullets. By teaching their captives English, they stripped away barriers of incomprehension. The power lay not in what was said, but in the simple act of communication. Suspicion softened when a guard corrected a prisoner's pronunciation. The shared laughter over a misused word became more powerful than threats or punishments. Some prisoners resisted fiercely. They folded their arms, refusing to mouth a single syllable, convinced this was propaganda disguised as kindness. Yet curiosity crept into the cracks. A sergeant, once proud and aloof, was overheard whispering numbers in English under his breath as he paced the yard. A young soldier scrawled clumsy phrases in a confiscated diary, careful to hide it from his fellow diehards. The camp, once defined by silence and hostility, began to buzz with murmurs of good morning and thank you. Outside the classroom, the transformation was visible. Prisoners who had mocked the effort at first began using English phrases at roll call. The guards, surprised, responded with patience, sometimes even pride. An unlikely exchange had begun. Power no longer rested only in rifles, but in the ability to understand. It was, in its quiet way, a revolution inside the wire. For these men, English was not merely a foreign language. It was a window into a culture they had been taught to despise, a culture that greeted them not with chains but with lessons. Each word learned was a small surrender not to America's weapons, but to its ideas. The barracks hummed with debates. Was this education a trick, or was it a chance to step beyond the confines of war to many? It felt as though the chalk lines drawn on the blackboard were erasing, stroke by stroke, the walls that propaganda had built in their minds. When the guards left and the lights dimmed, the true theater of learning began. Inside the barracks, amid the creak of wooden bunks and the faint smell of sweat and tobacco, prisoners whispered about the English classes. Some mocked the effort, muttering that it was a waste of time. Others leaned in closer, eager to repeat the strange phrases without the humiliation of making mistakes in front of the guards. It was here, in these low, flickering moments, That gossip became the hidden curriculum of the camp. A soldier who had been caught scribbling notes on a scrap of cement sack proudly passed his lesson book around, each page filled with crooked words: man, woman, peace, work. The men laughed at his clumsy handwriting, yet one by one they traced the words with their fingers, silently sounding them out. Another prisoner, who had once worked as a baker, compared English classes to kneading dough you push, fold, and stretch until it becomes something soft you can use. His metaphor was repeated until it became camp folklore. Confiscated diaries, later uncovered in archives, show the shift in tone. Entries that once cursed the Americans began noting small curiosities. Today we learned freedom, a strange word, used in many ways. Another read, the guards correct our mistakes kindly. They seem to enjoy our progress. Between these lines of broken English and halting German, history whispers the quiet truth that not every battlefield is fought with steel. The gossip extended to everyday life. Over tin mugs of ersatz coffee brewed from burnt grain, men argued about grammar. Should one say good night or good evening? A corporal teased a young recruit for calling a spoon a spun. These debates, once reserved for tactics and victories, now revolved around words that had once been as foreign as the moon. The tension was palpable. A group of loyal officers sneered at these discussions, warning that speaking English was treason against the fatherland. Their silence in the corner of the barracks was louder than any argument, but even they could not ignore the sound of laughter as younger men practiced greetings late into the night. Language was turning into contraband not hidden under floorboards, but openly carried in conversations, smuggled through jokes and gossip. The camp, which once echoed only with the clank of boots and the scrape of mess tins, now pulsed with an undercurrent of learning, as if every whispered word was chiseling away at the old certainties of war. Somewhere between ridicule and curiosity, between resentment and fascination, a transformation had begun, and it spread not from the classroom, but from the barracks themselves, in gossip, in laughter, and in the fragile courage of men daring to sound out a new world. At first, the hostility was unmistakable. Older officers sat stiff-backed in their bunks, arms crossed, lips pressed tight whenever English lessons were mentioned. To them, it was a humiliation, another way for the enemy to strip away dignity. Some refused outright, warning others that to learn the language of the Americans was to betray their homeland. But time has a way of eroding resistance, and within weeks, something began to change. The young were the first to crack. Restless recruits, barely out of adolescence, treated the classes with a mixture of mockery and mischief. They joked about mispronunciations, turned vocabulary into songs, and tested their words on the guards. Yet beneath the laughter lay a hunger, the desire to understand, to grasp something new. What began as play turned into practice. Late at night, voices could be heard whispering, repeating words as though they were secret passwords. One particular anecdote, preserved in camp notes, tells of a lieutenant who once scorned the lessons. He had insisted German was the only language worth speaking. But one evening, as the barracks fell quiet, he was overheard practicing a simple phrase over and over: "I am a man." His voice cracked, not from mispronunciation but from something deeper, as if the words themselves forced him to confront his stripped-down identity. No medals, no ranks, no army, just a man. Small moments became turning points. A soldier laughed so hard at his own mistake, saying sheep instead of ship, that even his stern bunkmates couldn't resist chuckling. Another, once bitter, found pride in being the first to spell his name correctly in English letters. The classroom had become a theater where former enemies discovered fragments of common humanity in the struggle to pronounce unfamiliar sounds. The barracks reflected this shift, where once silence and suspicion reigned. Now there was noise, sometimes argumentative, sometimes playful. The same men who had once cursed the guards now debated the difference between freedom and liberty. The camp, built to contain bodies, had accidentally become a laboratory for the mind. Curiosity did not erase the pain of captivity, nor did it dissolve the divisions overnight, but it cracked open a door. Through that door, prisoners glimpsed a world beyond barbed wire, a world where language was not just a weapon, but a bridge. And once that curiosity took root, it was impossible to uproot again. The irony was sharp. Men sent to conquer America were instead conquered by its words. Yet this quiet surrender was unlike any other. It was not written in treaties or carved into monuments. but in the whispered syllables echoing through the barracks long after the lights went out. It was never the grand speeches that changed the men, but the smallest lessons. A chalkboard scrawled with a single phrase could ripple through the camp like a dropped stone in still water. One morning, the guard wrote freedom of speech. The words sat awkwardly in German mouths, clumsy and heavy. Some repeated them with confusion, others with amusement. Yet the phrase lingered, like an echo that refused to die. That night, the barracks turned into a debating hall. What did freedom of speech truly mean? A corporal scoffed, reminding his bunkmates that in Germany, one careless word could mean a prison sentence. A younger recruit asked, "Then why are the guards teaching it to us? Do they not fear us repeating it?" The question hung in the smoky air. For men raised on propaganda, it was more than grammar, it was a crack in the walls of certainty. Everyday details deepened this shift. Over tin trays of beans and bread, men corrected each other's pronunciation, laughing when someone confused peace with peace. A guard, amused, even handed one soldier his lunch after the man managed to say in halting English, "Thank you very much." Small victories became fuel for pride. English was no longer just a subject. It was a badge of progress, a sign of belonging to something larger than the wire that enclosed them. Arguments arose too. Loyal Nazis hissed that the classes were poison, insisting that learning English was surrender. But even their defiance revealed something: they were afraid of the power words carried. And perhaps they were right. Words were reshaping the prisoners' identities more effectively than hunger or punishment ever could. It was a slow transformation, but a visible one. Guards reported fewer fights in the yard, more order during roll call. Laughter, genuine laughter, began punctuating the monotony of captivity. Even the guards were surprised. Teaching their enemy English had not only bridged communication, it had eased hostility. For the prisoners themselves, the lessons carried a more intimate weight. To master a phrase was to reclaim a sense of agency in a world where everything else had been stripped away, and to speak words like freedom and rights aloud was to imagine, even briefly, a life beyond submission. What do you think such lessons meant to men raised on strict obedience and silence? Did they hear only new sounds, or did they glimpse a new world forming in the shape of those words? The more words were spoken, the more tensions sharpened. The English classes had opened a door, but not every prisoner wanted to step through it. In the barracks, factions hardened. On one side were those who embraced the lessons, scribbling phrases in the margins of confiscated books or practicing with a stubborn determination late into the night. On the other side sat the loyalist men who clung to the old ideology, their silence thick with disapproval. The conflict did not always explode in shouts. Often, it revealed itself in smaller gestures, a diary hidden under straw, a notebook torn up by an angry comrade. A whispered correction stifled the moment an officer entered the room. Language itself had become a battlefield. The chalkboard and the bunks were trenches, the pencils and phrases ammunition. One story survived in the testimony of a former prisoner. A group of young men laughing over their first attempts to sing an English song were suddenly silenced when a senior officer stormed in. He looked at them with cold contempt and muttered, "You have forgotten who you are." The room fell quiet, the shame almost unbearable. And yet, hours later, one of the boys was heard softly humming the same tune in the dark. This silence was not peace, but tension. Captivity had stripped the prisoners of uniforms and weapons, but now language tested their identities. Were they Germans first, soldiers of a lost cause, or men simply trying to survive? To find meaning in something beyond the barbed wire. Everyday details sharpened this divide. At mealtime, one group of prisoners whispered, "Please and thank you," while others deliberately spoke only German, banging their tin cups in protest. A guard reported an argument so fierce over the word liberty that two men refused to share a bunk for weeks afterward. The Americans watched carefully. They knew they were not just teaching language, they were planting doubts, and doubts spread like fire. Some prisoners stared at the blackboard with longing, others with fury, but none remained untouched. Even those who refused to learn could not escape the sound of English echoing around them, seeping into their ears, breaking down walls of silence. Do you believe a language class could fracture loyalty more than hunger, cold, or fear? Could a single word, repeated often enough, be more dangerous to an ideology than the might of an army? The war ended, but the lessons did not. When the gates of the camps finally opened, thousands of men carried home not just memories of confinement, but fragments of a new language stitched into their thoughts. Some could manage only greetings, others entire sentences, but nearly all remembered the experience of learning. For many, it was their first real exposure to a world beyond orders, beyond slogans, beyond the walls of ideology. Years later, diaries and memoirs revealed how deeply those lessons endured. A former Africa Corps soldier wrote that he could still recite the alphabet song taught by a guard who had once been a schoolteacher in Kansas. Another confessed that his first job after the war working with American occupation authorities was possible only because he had practiced English in a prison camp. These men, once enemies, now found themselves translating documents, guiding visitors, or writing letters in the very language they had resisted. The impact stretched further. Historians noted that English-speaking POWs often became informal bridges in their communities. They helped rebuild towns by negotiating with Allied forces, or taught younger Germans English phrases that opened doors to jobs in a divided, occupied country. What began as a humiliation under barbed wire became, in hindsight, a gift of survival. There were also shadows. Some veterans admitted they felt guilty, as if speaking English had marked them with betrayal. In reunions decades later, heated arguments resurfaced. Had they been re-educated, manipulated, softened, or had they simply grasped at the only lifeline offered in captivity, even in old age? The question lingered, but alongside doubt stood something undeniable. Words once written in chalk under a wooden roof had outlived the war itself. The guards who taught, the prisoners who resisted, the whispers in the barracks all became part of a shared memory. A memory where language proved stronger than walls, and where simple lessons could change the course of lives long after the guns fell silent. Ex-POWs would later confess that what they remembered most was not the fences, nor the roll calls, but the strange joy of learning to say good morning in another tongue. For some, those two words carried them further than they could ever have imagined. The story of the English classes in American POW camps is not a tale of grand battles or decisive victories. It is a quieter story, one measured not in territory gained, but in words spoken, syllables practiced, and identities reshaped. Behind the wire, far from the front lines, men discovered that power could be exercised not through rifles or tanks, but through something as fragile as language. The rhythm of war had been thunder and steel. The rhythm of captivity was chalk scratching on a board, pencils scrawling on scraps of paper, whispers repeating phrases in the night. It was in these unremarkable details, a guard smiling at correct pronunciation, a prisoner clutching a notebook as if it were contraband, the laughter sparked by a simple mistake, that transformation quietly took root. Some men resisted, clinging to silence, convinced that words could not change what the war had already broken. Yet even they could not stop the sound of English from seeping through the barracks. Language worked its way into dreams, into diaries, into the hesitant conversations that bridged the gap between enemies, and in time, it outlived the fences themselves. Decades later, when soldiers had returned to their families and rebuilt their lives, the memories that endured were not only of hunger, cold, or fear, but of those moments when an unfamiliar phrase made them glimpse another world. A world where speech was freer, where ideas could flow unchained, where even the defeated could imagine belonging. Perhaps that is the true irony of war, that amidst destruction, seeds of understanding can still be planted, words written in chalk, fragile and fleeting, proved more enduring than barbed wire or uniforms. For some, they became the bridge between past and future, between enemy and ally.